Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to truly try and transport yourself. Let the sounds of your world fade away. Let go of the electric hum of your refrigerator, the glow of your screen, the traffic outside your window. We are traveling back in time. The year is 1888. The city is London. But this isn't the London you see in period dramas. The world of grand balls, polite society, and elegant carriages in Hyde Park. No, we are going to a different London. A city within the city. We are going to the East End. We are going to Whitechapel. Breathe in. The air here is a physical presence. It's thick, it's wet, it's heavy. It's a noxious cocktail of cheap coal smoke billowing from a million chimneys. The damp, fishy smell rising from the River Thames, the stench of tanneries and slaughterhouses, and the overwhelming, close-packed scent of unwashed humanity. Gas lamps hiss on every corner, their flickering, yellow light struggling to pierce the oppressive gloom. They cast long, dancing shadows that seem to have a life of their own, twisting and contorting in the narrow, labyrinthine alleyways. These streets are paved with cobblestones, slick with a near-permanent layer of grime, horse manure, and yesterday's rain. This is a world defined by a single, brutal reality: poverty. This is the London of the abyss, a place of sprawling slums and overcrowded rookeries, where entire families live in a single, unheated room. It's a world of gin palaces, offering a fleeting, fiery escape for a few pennies, and of common lodging houses or doss houses, where that same pittance buys you not a bed, but a spot on a filthy floor, or the right to lean against a rope strung across the room for the night, the infamous four-penny coffin. Life here is a relentless struggle for survival. It's cheap, it's hard, and for many, it's short. Darkness in all its forms is king. And in the autumn of this year, a new kind of darkness descended upon Whitechapel, a terror that was more primal, more focused than the daily specters of poverty or disease. This was an active, malevolent intelligence, a phantom, a faceless, nameless fear that stalked these grim streets, armed with a long, sharp knife and a chillingly specific purpose. He would become a legend, a global boogeyman whispered about for over a century, a name born from a taunting letter, allegedly sent by the killer himself to mock the authorities, a name that has become synonymous with the ultimate unsolved mystery: Jack the Ripper. Welcome, fellow explorers of the unknown, to our deep dive into one of the most infamous and enduring cases in the entire history of historical true crime. For more than 130 years, the world has been captivated by a single maddening question. Who was he? The police of the Victorian era, for all their bluster and authority, were left utterly baffled, chasing shadows, sifting through a sea of false leads and public hysteria. They investigated thousands, interviewed hundreds, and in the end, compiled a list of serial killer suspects, a veritable gallery of ghosts, each with their own dark secrets, their own plausibility, their own lingering questions. Tonight, we are going to walk through that gallery. We are not just recounting the crimes. We are going to do what the detectives of the time couldn't. We will use over a century of research, analysis, and debate to peel back the layers of time. We will examine the evidence, weigh the theories, and scrutinize the lives of the most prominent men ever accused of being the Whitechapel murderer. This isn't just a ghost story. We're on a quest for a ghost of a man who committed some of the most brutal and shocking crimes imaginable and then, just as suddenly as he appeared, vanished back into the London fog from whence he came, leaving behind only a bloody legacy and a name. So dim the lights, pour yourself something to drink, get comfortable. We are about to journey back to the blood-soaked streets of Whitechapel and confront the many faces of Jack the Ripper. Before we meet the suspects, we must first meet the victims. It is the most important thing we can do, because behind the legend, behind the sensationalism and the dark tourism, 5 women lost their lives. They were not just props in a killer's story. They were the story's tragic heart. They were collectively known as the unfortunates, women forced by poverty, alcoholism, or broken marriages into the perilous life of streetwalking to earn enough for a meal or a bed for the night. Our story begins in the pre-dawn hours of August 31st, 1888. A cart driver named Charles Cross is walking down Bucks Row, a dark and quiet street, on his way to work. In a shadowed gateway, he sees a bundle on the ground. At first glance, he thinks it's a discarded tarpaulin sheet. He calls out to another man walking behind him, Robert Paul. Together they approach. It's only when they are standing over it that the electric jolt of horror hits them. This is no bundle. It's the body of a woman. Her skirt is raised to her waist. They touch her face. It's still warm, but as they look closer, they see the horrific truth in the gloom. Her throat has been cut, a savage, deep incision from ear to ear, so violent that she was nearly decapitated. This was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly. She was 43 years old, a mother of 5 who had separated from her husband due to her struggles with alcohol. That night, she had been turned out of her lodging house because she didn't have the 4 pence for a bed. Her last known words to the lodging housekeeper were, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." She was seen walking down Whitechapel Road, hoping to earn that money. She never made it back. Polly was the first of what would come to be known as the canonical 5 victims. The police were called, but in 1888, forensic science as we know it was non-existent. There was no DNA analysis, no fingerprinting database, no CCTV footage to review. The investigation was a grueling, frustrating process of shoe leather and intuition. Detectives walked the streets, interviewed potential witnesses, and tried to piece together a timeline. But the witnesses reported frustratingly vague things. A man, maybe well-dressed, maybe shabby, maybe with a mustache, maybe not. He was a phantom from the very beginning. Just over a week later, on the morning of September 8th, the killer struck again. In the dirty, enclosed backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, a resident named John Davis made a ghastly discovery. The body of Annie Chapman. The horror was amplified. Not only was her throat cut in the same brutal, 2-slice manner as Polly's, but her abdomen had been sliced open. Her uterus and parts of her bladder and vagina had been expertly excised and taken from the scene. This was a terrifying escalation. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was something else. Something methodical. Something monstrous. The killer clearly possessed anatomical knowledge, or at the very least, a terrifying level of skill and confidence with a blade. Panic began to grip the East End. The press, in its infancy of yellow journalism, fanned the flames of fear. Newspapers with sensational names like the Illustrated Police News published lurid, often inaccurate, sketches and wild theories. The killer was dubbed the Whitechapel Murderer, and, based on a local prejudice against Jewish tradesmen, Leather Apron. And then, on September 27th, the Central News Agency in London received a letter. Written in crude, spidery red ink, it was filled with taunts and boasts. It began with the now infamous salutation, "Dear Boss," and it mocked the police for their incompetence. "I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled," it read. The author promised to clip the lattice ears off in his next job. And then, at the bottom, he gave himself the name that would echo through history. He signed it, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Whether this letter was genuinely from the killer or a cruel journalistic hoax is a debate that rages to this day. Many modern experts believe it was a prank by a journalist to keep the story selling. But it didn't matter. The name was too powerful, too catchy. It stuck. It gave the formless terror a handle. It turned a murderer into a media superstar. 3 days later, the killer who now called himself Jack the Ripper embarked on his most audacious night of terror, what became known as the double event. In the early hours of September 30th, the body of Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard, off Burner Street. She was a Swedish immigrant, known as Long Liz. Her throat was cut, but her body was otherwise untouched. The prevailing theory is that the killer was interrupted just as he began his work, possibly by a man named Louis Diemschutz who entered the yard with his pony and cart, causing the killer to flee. But he wasn't finished for the night. Enraged, or perhaps just determined, the killer moved quickly through the dark streets. Less than an hour later, and only a short walk away, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in a corner of Mitre Square, within the boundaries of the City of London Police District, a direct challenge to a second police force. The brutality was staggering. Her throat was cut. Her face was horribly mutilated, with her nose cut off and gashes on her cheeks. Her abdomen was ripped open. Her left kidney and a major part of her uterus had been taken. This same night, a piece of Catherine's bloody apron was found in a doorway in Golston Street. Above it, scrawled in chalk on the wall, was a message. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Fearing it would spark anti-Semitic riots in the already tense neighborhood, the police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, ordered the message to be washed away before it could be photographed. Was this a genuine clue from the killer, or a piece of racist graffiti that was coincidentally there? It's one of the case's most frustrating lost pieces of evidence. The city was now in a state of full-blown panic. Vigilance committees were formed by concerned citizens who patrolled the streets themselves. The police, led by the diligent Inspector Frederick Aberline of Scotland Yard, were under immense, unbearable pressure, chasing down thousands of leads, interviewing hundreds of people, but getting no closer to their man. The reign of terror reached its gruesome, unforgettable climax on the morning of November 9, 1888. This final act was so horrific it almost defies description. Mary Jane Kelly, at 25, was the youngest and final canonical victim. Unlike the others, she was murdered indoors, in the relative privacy of her small room at 13 Miller's Court. When her landlord, worried that she was late with her rent, sent his assistant to knock, there was no answer. Peering through a broken pane of glass in the window, the man saw a vision from hell. The scene was a slaughterhouse. Mary Kelly's body, lying on the bed, had been completely eviscerated. Her organs, including her heart, were placed around the roomsome on the bedside table, some beneath her head. Her face was carved away beyond all recognition. It was an explosion of pure, unadulterated rage, the work of a man who had hours to indulge his most depraved fantasies without fear of interruption. And then silence. After the butchery of Mary Jane Kelly, the murders that fit the Ripper's distinct pattern simply stopped. Jack the Ripper, after holding an entire city hostage with fear for one terrifying autumn, melted back into the shadows. He was never caught. His identity was never confirmed. But he left behind questions. And he left behind suspects. Hundreds of them. Over the decades, that list has been narrowed down by researchers, focusing on a handful of men whose lives and circumstances placed them in the terrifying orbit of this mystery. Now it's time for us to meet them. Let's step into the metaphorical police station of 1888, open the cold case files, and analyze the primary serial killer suspects in the Jack the Ripper case. Our first suspect is a man who, for many years, was considered the #1 candidate by the very top of Scotland Yard. He represents the convenient solution, the man whose story provides a neat, tidy ending to an otherwise messy affair. His name was Montague John Druitt. Druitt was, on the surface, the absolute antithesis of a slum-dwelling killer. He was born into a respectable upper-middle-class family. His father was a prominent surgeon. Druitt himself was a graduate of Winchester College and Oxford University, the pinnacle of the British establishment. He was a qualified barrister, a lawyer, though he mostly made his living as an assistant schoolmaster at a boarding school in Blackheath, a leafy suburb miles away from the squalor of Whitechapel. He was handsome, athletic, a talented cricketer. He was, by all accounts, a gentleman. So why in the world did his name ever land on a list of suspects for such brutal, low-class crimes? The entire theory hinges on timing and a single, crucial police memo. On December 31st, 1888, nearly 2 months after the final, horrific murder of Mary Jane Kelly, Druitt's body was pulled from the River Thames near Chiswick. His pockets were filled with stones. He had been missing for weeks. A suicide note was found in his room, addressed to his brother. It read, in part, "Since Friday I felt I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die." His mother had suffered from severe depression and paranoia and had been institutionalized. His own father had taken his life years earlier. The key piece of information comes from Sir Melville Macnaghten, an assistant chief constable at Scotland Yard who joined the force in 1889, just after the Ripper murders had ceased. In a private memorandum written in 1894, intended for internal police use only, he named his 3 top suspects. Montague John Druitt was number 1. Macnaghten wrote that he had private information that Druitt's own family believed him to have been the murderer. He also noted that Druitt was sexually insane. The theory was simple and compelling. Druitt, harboring a secret madness, committed the murders. Then, either consumed by guilt or feeling the police net tightening, he took his own life. The timing is almost perfect. The last murder was November 9th. Druitt disappears around November 30th and is later found dead. Case closed, right? A madman kills, then kills himself. It wraps everything up with a bow. Well, not so fast. The case for Druitt is almost entirely circumstantial and based on the hearsay of one high-ranking official writing years after the fact. There is zero physical evidence or witness testimony linking Druitt to Whitechapel. None of the witness descriptions, as vague as they were, match him particularly well. His job as a schoolmaster in Blackheath would have given him a very solid alibi for at least some of the murders. For example, on Saturday, September 1st, the day after Polly Nichols was killed, he was playing in a cricket match. While not impossible for him to have been in Whitechapel the night before, it stretches credulity. And what about his motive? Macnaghten's claim that he was sexually insane is unsubstantiated. What does that even mean? A more concrete piece of the puzzle is that he was abruptly fired from his teaching job on November 30th, the very day he disappeared. The reason given was a serious trouble that was never specified. Was this trouble the discovery that he was a mass murderer? Or was it something else entirely? Some modern theories suggest Druitt may have been homosexual, which was a criminal offense in the Victorian era. A scandal like that would have been enough to ruin him and could have easily led to his suicide, having nothing to do with the Ripper crimes. Montague Druitt feels like a convenient scapegoat, an upper-class man, dead by his own hand, whose own family, perhaps out of shame or confusion about his suicide, suspected the worst. For the police, pinning it on him was a neat way to unofficially close a very messy and publicly embarrassing case. But the evidence is gossamer thin. He remains a suspect of convenience, a ghost whose primary connection to the case is the timing of his own tragic end. So, if not Druitt, then who? Let's turn to the second name on Macnaghten's list. A man who was the personal favorite suspect of Inspector Frederick Aberline, the lead investigator on the ground. A man who was, without a doubt, a monster. His name was Søren Klosowski, but he is better known by his anglicized alias, George Chapman. Now, on paper, Chapman is a far more compelling suspect than Drut. He was a Polish immigrant who had trained in his home country as a Feldschirurz, a type of barber surgeon. He arrived in London around 1887 and, crucially, he lived and worked right in the heart of Whitechapel during the entire Autumn of Terror in 1888. He ran a barber shop on the corner of George Yard, the very place where the body of another victim, Martha Tabram, often considered a possible early Ripper victim, had been found. He had experience with knives and at least a rudimentary knowledge of human anatomy. He fits the profile of a local killer. The witness descriptions, while notoriously unreliable, offer some tantalizing connections. A woman named Elizabeth Long claimed she saw Annie Chapman with a man shortly before she died. She described him as having a shabby-genteel appearance, a dark complexion, and appearing to be a foreigner. This could fit Chapman. Another witness, Mary Ann Cox, saw Mary Kelly with a stout man with a dark mustache and a carroty complexion on the night of her murder, a description that also bore a passing resemblance to George Chapman. He was there. He had the opportunity. He had the basic skills. But the most damning evidence against George Chapman has nothing to do with the Ripper murders at all. Years later, long after the Whitechapel panic had subsided, Chapman was arrested, tried, and convicted for the cold-blooded murders of 3 of his common-law wives. He systematically and cruelly poisoned them one by one with a compound called antimony, likely for insurance money. He was a proven serial killer, a cold, calculating misogynist who preyed on the women in his life. When he was finally convicted and sentenced to hang in 1903, the now-retired Inspector Aberline reportedly visited his old colleagues at Scotland Yard, slapped his hand on the table and exclaimed, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." So, we have a man who lived in the right area at the right time. He had medical skills. He was a known, proven serial killer of women. The case seems incredibly strong. But again, there are significant problems. The Ripper's method was explosive, frenzied, a blitz attack with a knife. It was an act of mutilation and rage. Chapman's method was the polar opposite. It was slow, patient, and methodical, using poison over weeks or months. This stark difference in MO is a major sticking point for criminologists and ripperologists. Could a killer really change his murder weapon and entire psychological approach so drastically? It's not unheard of, but it is extremely rare. It's the difference between a bomb and a slow-acting virus. Furthermore, just like with Drut, there's no direct, physical evidence linking him to the 5 canonical murders. It's all strong, compelling circumstantial evidence. Proximity, means, and a proven capacity for evil. Aberline was convinced, and his gut feeling as the lead investigator carries a lot of weight. But a conviction in a court of law would have been impossible. George Chapman remains one of the top-tier suspects, a man who was undeniably a monster. But was he the monster? The question lingers, suspended in doubt. This brings us to our third, and perhaps most fascinating of the classic suspects. The third man on Macnaghten's list, and the man who seems to be the focus of the police's most intense, albeit private, suspicions. A man whose name was whispered in the halls of Scotland Yard but never made public. A man who, thanks to a controversial modern scientific claim, has come roaring back to the forefront of the investigation. His name was Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was another Polish immigrant, but his story is far more tragic and pathetic than Chapman's. He was a Jewish hairdresser who lived on Greenfield Street, right in the epicenter of the murder district. And he was a man plagued by profound mental illness. We know this from his asylum records. By 1890, his mental state had deteriorated so severely that he was admitted to the Mile End Old Town Workhouse Infirmary, and from there he was sent to a series of asylums, including Coney Hatch and Leavesden, where he would spend the rest of his life, dying in 1919. His medical records paint a grim picture. He suffered from auditory hallucinations, a paranoid fear of being poisoned that caused him to eat food from the gutter, and an aversion to women. The asylum case notes mention his incoherence and his solitary and self-abusive habits. This Porphyria paranoid, misogynistic man, prone to outbursts and living in the exact location of the crime, is a chillingly good fit for the Ripper. The case for Kosminski doesn't just come from profiling, though. It comes from the highest levels of the police. As mentioned, Macnaghten named him as his third suspect, describing him as a Polish Jew who worked as a hairdresser and who had a great hatred of women, with strong homicidal tendencies. But the most powerful evidence comes from what are known as the Swanson margins. Chief Constable Donald Swanson was one of the key officers on the case. Years later, in his personal copy of the memoirs of his superior, Sir Robert Anderson, he wrote notes in the margins. Anderson wrote that the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew. Swanson, in his notes, elaborated, stating that the suspect was identified by a witness at what was called a seaside home, likely a convalescent home. The witness, who was also Jewish, saw the suspect with one of the victims and identified him to police. However, the witness refused to testify against a fellow Jew. Swanson states the suspect was identified as Kosminski, and that after he was confined to an asylum, the murders ceased. This is powerful, almost explosive stuff. The lead investigators, in their private writings, point to one man. The timeline fits perfectly. The murders stop right around the time Kosminski's mental health completely collapses, leading to his institutionalization in early 1891. For over a century, this was where the Kosminski theory stood: strong police suspicion, a compelling profile but no hard proof. Then, in 2007, everything changed. An author and amateur sleuth named Russell Edwards bought a silk shawl that was allegedly found by the body of the fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes. The story goes that a police officer at the scene took it home for his wife, and it was passed down through his family. Edwards, believing this was the key, enlisted a molecular biologist, Dr. Jari Luhalainen, to conduct DNA tests on stains found on the fabric. The results, when published in 2014, were a global sensation. Luhalainen claimed to have found mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, on the shawl that matched a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes. And, crucially, he claimed to have found mtDNA from seminal stains that matched a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski's sister. The case, it seemed, was finally solved. The headlines screamed, "Jack the Ripper's identity revealed." But in the world of historical true crime, nothing is ever that simple. The scientific and historical communities immediately pushed back, and hard. They pointed out major flaws in the methodology. Firstly, the provenance of the shawl is shaky at best. There is no official record of it being found at the crime scene. The chain of custody over 120 years is completely broken. Could it have been contaminated? Absolutely. Secondly, the science itself was criticized. Mitochondrial DNA is not unique like nuclear DNA. It's passed down the maternal line and can be shared by thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people in a population. The scientific paper was not published in a major peer-reviewed journal, and many geneticists have dismissed the findings as unreliable and statistically insignificant. So where does that leave us with Aaron Kosminski? We have a man who was in the right place at the right time. He had a documented hatred of women and severe mental illness that fit the likely profile of the killer. He was named, privately, by the very men leading the hunt for the Ripper as their primary, identified but unprosecutable suspect. And we have a tantalizing, but deeply flawed piece of modern forensic evidence that points directly at him. Of all the classic suspects, Aaron Kosminski arguably remains the most compelling, the one who ticks the most boxes, even if the final, definitive proof, the smoking gun, remains just out of reach. Now, Our investigation has so far focused on the suspects favored by the police. Men who lived in the shadows of Whitechapel. But what if the killer wasn't one of them? What if he was someone hiding in plain sight? Someone from a completely different world, playing a dark game with both the public and the police? This brings us to a more modern and far more controversial theory. A theory that points the finger at a celebrated artist. The suspect, Walter Sickert. This theory was championed, most famously and expensively, by the best-selling American crime novelist Patricia Cornwell. She has spent millions of dollars of her own money over the past 2 decades attempting to prove that Walter Sickert, a famous British Impressionist painter, was Jack the Ripper. It sounds like something out of a Gothic novel, doesn't it? A brilliant artist with a secret, monstrous life. The case Cornwell builds is intricate, sprawling, and, to her supporters, deeply compelling. Sickert, as an artist, was known for his fascination with the grimier, darker side of London life. He was drawn to music halls, dingy interiors, and scenes of urban malaise. Most provocatively, he painted a grim picture of a dark room which he titled Jack the Ripper's Bedroom, claiming it was the former lodging of a man he suspected of being the killer. Cornwell argues this wasn't just a painting. It was a taunt, a clue hidden in plain sight, a boast from the killer himself. She also posits that many of his other paintings contain hidden imagery and symbolism that allude to the murders. His famous series of paintings known as the Camden Town Murder, depicting a slain nude woman on a bed, bears a chilling resemblance to the crime scene photographs of Mary Jane Kelly. Was he painting from a morbid imagination or from memory? Cornwell also pushes a theory that Sickert was impotent due to a series of childhood surgeries on his genitals, and that this fueled a murderous rage against women. Cornwell's team also conducted their own DNA tests. She bought up dozens of Sickert's paintings and letters. Her team claimed to have extracted mitochondrial DNA from the gum on stamps from letters sent by Sickert, and compared it to DNA from the stamps on some of the Ripper letters. She announced they had found a match, suggesting the same person, or at least a maternal relative, was responsible for both sets of correspondence. She also pointed to paper analysis, arguing that stationery used by Sickert and the author of some Ripper letters came from the same rare paper stock. But, just like the Kosminski DNA, this theory has been widely and ferociously debunked by the vast majority of Ripperologists and historians. First, as we've discussed, most experts believe the Dear Boss and Saucy Jackie letters are hoaxes. So linking Sickert to a known hoax doesn't prove he was the killer. The one letter that many believe could be genuine, the From Hell letter which came with half a human kidney, has no DNA link to Sickert. The DNA evidence she presented is, once again, mitochondrial and suffers from the same issues of contamination and lack of specificity. Most damningly for the theory, there's the issue of Sickert's location. Extensive documentation, including personal correspondence and dated sketches, places Walter Sickert in France for most of the autumn of 1888, when the canonical 5 murders took place. While it's not a 100% airtight alibi for every single date, it makes it highly improbable that he could have been the man stalking the streets of Whitechapel night after night. The Sickert theory is a fascinating example of how this case continues to capture the imagination. It's a grand, conspiratorial narrative that weaves together art, high society, and murder. But for most serious researchers, it remains a captivating work of fiction, not fact. A case built on speculation and confirmation bias, where every shadow in a painting becomes a confession. Druitt, Chapman, Kosminski, Sickert. These are the big 4, the names that dominate any discussion of Jack the Ripper. But they are far from the only ones. The list of potential suspects is a rabbit hole of its own. There's James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant whose name only came to light in the early 1990s when a scrapbook, allegedly a diary written by him, surfaced. In its pages, the author confesses in chilling detail to being Jack the Ripper, claiming the murders were revenge for his wife's infidelity. The diary is filled with details that seem to match the case. For a time, it was hailed as the solution, but its authenticity is fiercely debated. Experts have pointed to factual inaccuracies, handwriting inconsistencies, and the suspicious timing of its discovery. Many now believe it to be a clever and elaborate modern forgery. There's Dr. Francis Tumblety, a flamboyant, eccentric American quack doctor who was in London at the time. He was a flamboyant character, a known and vitriolic misogynist who, according to a friend, kept a collection of female anatomical parts, specifically uteri, in jars in his study. He was actually arrested in November 1888 on charges of gross indecency. But, sensing more serious trouble, he paid his bail, fled the country, and returned to America, forever out of the reach of Scotland Yard. He had the hatred, he had the supposed anatomical interest, and he had the opportunity. A very compelling, if fleeting, suspect. And then there's the most radical theory of all, the one that turns the entire profile on its head. What if Jack was actually Jill the Ripper? This theory proposes the killer was a woman, perhaps a local midwife, who would have been a common sight on the streets at all hours. She could move about freely, and her blood-stained clothes, if seen, would not have aroused suspicion, easily explained away by her profession. She would possess the necessary anatomical knowledge to perform the mutilations. A woman named Mary Piercy is often cited as a possible Jill. In 1890, she was convicted and executed for murdering her lover's wife and infant child in a manner of extreme brutality that some saw as reminiscent of the Ripper's work. It's an intriguing idea, but one with almost no direct evidence to support it. So after all this, after walking through the fog of history and examining the evidence, the theories, and the ghosts of these men, where does it leave us? Who was Jack the Ripper? The cold, hard, and deeply unsatisfying truth is we will almost certainly never know for sure. The trail went cold over 130 years ago. The physical evidence is gone, degraded by time. The witnesses are long dead. All we have left are these stories, these shadows, these suspects. If we are forced to place a bet, to use the balance of probabilities, the police suspects remain the most plausible. Men who were on the ground, in the filth and the fear of Whitechapel. Men like George Chapman and, most compellingly, Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski, in particular, seems to fit like a key in a lock. His proximity, his documented mental decline, his misogyny, and the fact that the top brass of the investigation privately named him all point in his direction. It feels like they knew who he was, but in an age before modern forensics, in a world where a witness's refusal to testify could stop a case cold, they simply couldn't prove it. He fits the profile of a disorganized, mentally ill killer whose crimes were an explosion of rage, culminating in the horrific, unrestrained butchery of Mary Jane Kelly in the privacy of her room. After that, his mind likely shattered completely, leading to his incarceration and the abrupt end of the terror. But the enduring power of the Jack the Ripper case lies not in a definitive answer, but in its eternal, haunting ambiguity. He is a blank slate onto which we can project our greatest fears about the darkness that can lurk behind a human face. He was the first modern media-created serial killer, a celebrity monster whose legend grew far beyond the grim reality of his crimes, thanks to a new, sensationalist press. The case also had a profound, lasting legacy. The gruesome murders shone a bright, unforgiving light on the horrific poverty and social conditions of the East End, shocking the conscience of Victorian society and helping to spur on calls for social reform. It forced police forces to begin developing more sophisticated methods of investigation, laying the groundwork for modern criminology and criminal profiling. In a very real way, The hunt for Jack the Ripper was the crucible in which the 20th century approach to murder investigation was forged. But as we wrap up our investigation tonight, it's crucial to bring it back to where we started. Beyond the legend, beyond the thrilling mystery and the gallery of suspects, there were the victims. Let's say their names one more time. Mary and Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They weren't just names in a historical true crime story. They were real women. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, wives. They lived lives of unimaginable hardship and desperation, only to have them stolen from them in the most brutal way imaginable by a man who, in the end, achieved what he likely wanted most: eternal infamy, while he remained a ghost. His true identity is a secret the Victorian fog has kept for more than a century, and it's a secret it will likely keep forever. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. I want to know what you think. After hearing the detailed cases against the main serial killer suspects, who stands out to you? Are you convinced by the police's choice, the tragic and disturbed Aaron Kosminski? Does the proven evil of George Chapman make him your prime suspect? Or do you lean towards the convenient suicide of Montague Druitt? Perhaps you're captivated by the artistic conspiracy of Walter Sickert, or you have a theory about a suspect we didn't even cover in depth. Let me know your theories and your choice for the most likely suspect in the comments below. This is a conversation that has been going on for over 130 years, and every new voice adds a fascinating new perspective to this enduring mystery. And if you were captivated by this deep dive into the shadows of the Victorian era, please make sure to show your support by hitting that like button and, most importantly, subscribing to the channel for more explorations into history's greatest unsolved cases. Ring that notification bell, because you never know what mystery we'll be uncovering next. Thank you for joining me in the fog-shrouded alleyways of Whitechapel. Until next time, stay curious.